Oh, that is so true, Lord. We are in desperately need of your Spirit. We are in desperately need of the Word, your Word. And I pray now that you would bring those two things together as we open your Word, that your Holy Spirit would just breathe life into us. Lord, I pray that you would guard my lips from saying anything that would diminish the glory of your name. But we would amplify your glory today. May you be made famous in our midst, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, grab your Bibles and open up to Job chapter 38. Job chapter 38. We are in our series on Job. We got 3 weeks, including today, left. We've been working our way through Job, and we're going to get to the part in the end where God speaks. Job chapter 38, God speaks two speeches to Job at the end of the book, in 38 and 39, and then 40 and 41. Today we are going to focus on his first speech, and there's a lot in here, so we want to get in that. And then next week we're going to focus on his second speech, and that's the ultimate encouragement for Job. So I hope this morning that you brought a Red Bull. You're alert in mind, because we are going to stare at the inscrutable God, the God that we can't quite understand or comprehend, and hopefully our mouth will drop open just like Job's does, and we'll put our hand over our mouth and go, I am so unworthy, because this gets really, really good. Now, if you're like me, when you're reading the book of Job and you read the first two chapters, it's easy to understand. God is speaking to Satan. You understand the whole dynamic, and then Job's life kind of turns upside down. God doesn't make sense. All kinds of pain and suffering comes into his life. And then from Job chapter 3 to chapter 37 is this long dialogue. It's this confusing cyclical vortex, I call it. You just want God to speak by the end. You're just like, I'm so confused. They're rehashing the same bullet points. They're in the hamster wheel. It feels like the conversation is going nowhere, and you just want God to speak. And we're meant to see that, by the way, to see the limit of our language, that sometimes when bad things happen, that we just can't talk it out and find some resolution. That we end up kind of recircling the same stuff, rehashing the same stuff, and we're in a hamster wheel and we can't get anywhere, and it's this confusing cyclical vortex. And we get to that point, and we're just like, God, can you just please speak? This is a long book. And finally, God does speak. And in a sense, Job and his friends from chapter 3 to chapter 37 are trying to master the divine, master God. Well, they should have just asked me, right? After all, I have a master of divinity. So does Jonathan. He's got a master's as well. They should have just asked us, right? We've mastered the divine. I'm going to get struck by lightning here pretty soon, you know. No, that's not how seminary works. Usually in seminary, Jonathan will tell you this, you go in with this many questions and you get about half of those answered, but then it opens up a whole infinity of other questions that you cannot answer. And that's what happens with Job here, okay, as they try to master the divine. Now, throughout Job chapter 3, verse 31, this is Job's contention with God. In all of his raging against God, he's saying, basically, I'm not sure that you run the universe with any order or fairness. And it's deeply personal to him, because he is asking the question, am I ultimately safe with you, God? And some of you are asking that this morning. Because when pain happens, when extreme suffering happens, you start questioning on whether God has any order or fairness in what he's doing in the world. And you are deeply asking this question in your heart, am I ultimately safe with you, God? And that's what Job is asking. When God finally speaks here at the end of the book, we see Job, he puts his hand over his mouth and he says, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you, not your? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. Now, we said in week number 2, as we talked about what it means to suffer wisely and well, that there is a place That there is a place in the Christian walk to offer a raw and an honest and emotional prayer to God without cursing him. There's a place for that. And sometimes you don't need to feel any shame if you do that. Sometimes as believers, you need to do that. You see that in the book of Psalms. And there's no shame in that. There's this raw, there's emotional, and there's this honest prayer without cursing God. Job never crosses that line and says, expletive you, God. But sometimes, or shall I say, true wisdom and understanding that sustains a person through suffering is when a person knows when to put their hand over their mouth and let God be God. This morning, we can read this speech of God, and he basically gives Job a glimpse of his inscrutableness. Remember that word that we learned the first week? It's impossible to understand or comprehend. And he gives Job a glimpse of this impossible, infinite God. And we could just kind of read through this and gloss over it and take the 1,000-foot view, and we can come up with a pithy sentence that says there's more going on than we can possibly take on. We can write it on a bumper sticker. We can write it on our mirror. When painful things happen, we can say there's more going on than I can possibly take on. But there's a whole lot more in here. If we truly want to hear what Job hears and drop our jaw and put our hand over our mouth, we can see that God is saying some amazingly profound things about how he runs the universe. So in a sense today, we're not going to answer the inscrutable. We're going to amplify it. And I pray that by the end, we have put our hand over our mouth and just say, I am unworthy, God. So we're going to read Job chapter 38 and 39. We're going to read it all just to kind of get the whole vibe of this argument. And I see 4 movements in here. But before we jump into that, I just want to make a word about God's tone. It seems like God is angry. Sometimes you read this and you seem like God explodes at Job. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily that he's angry at Job for a few reasons. And first off is that God frames everything he says to Job in questions. And that's pretty mild. It's kind of like the father in Proverbs speaking to the son, asking him kind of rhetorical questions or questions that he can't answer, just to kind of instruct him. And by framing it instead of questions, instead of you weren't, you don't know, like putting his finger at him, he's instructing him. So that it takes the kind of the edge off. I know there is kind of an omni edge to what he says here. You can't get around that. But the fact that he frames it in questions kind of takes a little bit of that edge off. Secondly, in Job chapter 31, the last time Job speaks, 16 times, he basically puts an oath out to God, basically saying, if I've done this, then you do this. If I've done this, then you do this. If I've done this, then you do this. And he's challenging God. If I've done anything wrong, like he says, if I have lusted after a woman, may another man take my wife. If I have failed to give money to the poor, then may this happen to me. I want you to bring down condemnation on me. If I've done this, and he goes through a whole list of things. And God doesn't even address those things. So in a sense, Job is justified here. Okay? So we need to hear that. And thirdly, the very first thing we learn about Job is what? He's a man who what, God? He fears God. He doesn't want to do anything to diminish the glory of his name. He wants to live his life bringing glory to his name. He is God and I am not. So in a sense, God is speaking Job's language here, right? He's speaking God language. I think Job is just glad that he has his friend back, God, and probably closer than he ever has in his life. He's just glad he's got his friend back. That's what he's saying. I miss the relationship that I had with my God. Whatever happened to him? And now God speaks to him. He's just glad he has his friend back. It doesn't matter. God's speaking to him. God hasn't written him off, okay? So yes, there is a bit of an omni edge to what God says here. But it could have been worse. It could have been worse. But he has to come down and speak to a mortal here. So let's just keep that in mind. Okay, let's listen to God's argument as God speaks in the end. Job chapter 38. Remember his contention. I'm not sure you run the universe with any order or fairness. Am I ultimately safe with you? Okay, let's stand and read this whole argument that God says in Job 38. It says, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. Now keep that in mind. We're going to come back to that later. And he said, who is this who obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footing set, or who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind the doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness, when I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place, when I said, this far you may come and no farther, here your proud ways must halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? The earth takes shape like clay under a seal. Its features stand like those out of a garment. The wicked are denied their light, and their upraised arms are broken. Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you seen the gates of the deepest darkness? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know this. What is the way to the abode of light? And where does darkness reside? Can you take them to their places? Do you know the paths to their dwellings? Surely you know, for you were already born. You've lived so many years. Have you entered the storehouses of snow, or seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for times of trouble, for days of war and battle? What is the way to the place where lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? Who cuts a canal for the torrents of rain and the path of the thunderstorm, to water the land where no one lives, an uninhabited desert, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass? Does the rain have a father? Who fathers the drops of dew? From whose womb comes the ice? Who gives birth to the frost from the heavens, when the waters come hard as stone, when the surface of the deep is frozen? Alberta. Can you bind the chains of Pleiades? Can you loose the Orion's belt? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set God's dominion over the earth? Can you raise up your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, here we are? Who gives the ibis wisdom? Who gives the rooster understanding? Who has the wisdom to count the clouds? Who can tip over the water jars of heavens when the dust becomes hard and clods of earth stick together? Can you hunt the prey for the lioness and satisfy the hunger of the lions when they crouch in their dens or lie await in the thicket? Who provides food for the raven when its young cry out to God and wander for lack of food? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth? Do you watch when the doe bears her fawn? Do you count the months till they bear? Do you know the time they give birth? They crouch down and bring forth their young. Their labor pains are ended. Their young thrive and grow strong in the wilds. They leave and do not return. Who let the wild donkey go free? Who untied its ropes? I gave it the wasteland as its home, the salt flats as its habitat. It laughs at the commotion in the town. It does not hear the driver shout. It ranges the hill for its pasture and searches for any green thing. Will the isled ox consent to serve you? Will it stay in your manger at night? Can you hold it to the furrow with a harness? Will it till the valleys behind you? Will you rely on it for great strength? Will you leave your heavy work for it? Can you trust it to haul your grain and bring it to your threshing floor? The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, though they cannot compare to the wings and feathers of a stork. She lays her eggs in the ground and lets them warm in the sand, unmindful that a foot may crush them and some wild animal may trample them. She treats her young harshly, as if they were not hers. She cares not, for her labor was in vain. For God did not endow her with wisdom or give her a share of good sense. I love that. Yet when she spreads her feathers to run, she laughs at the horse and rider. Did you give the horse its strength, or the clothe its neck with a flowing mane? Did you make it leap like a locust, striking terror with its proud snorting? It paws fiercely, rejoicing at its strength, and charges into the fray. It laughs at fear, afraid of nothing. It does not shy away from the sword. The quiver rattles against its side. Along the flashing spear and lance, in frenzies excitement, it eats up the ground. It cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. At the blast of the trumpet, it snorts. Aha! It catches the scent of battle from afar, the shout of the commanders and the battle cry. Does the hawk take flight by your wisdom and spread its wings toward the south? Does the eagle soar at your command and build its nest on high? It dwells on a cliff and stays there at night. A rocky crag is its stronghold, and from there it looks for food. Its eyes detect it from afar. Its young ones feast on blood, and where the slain are, there it is. You can have a seat. And it's from there that Job puts his hand over his mouth and says, I'm unworthy. Now remember Job's contention here. He says, I'm not sure you run the universe with any order or fairness. Am I ultimately safe with you? And I see four movements in this whole long speech of God to Job, where Job answers that question. Movement number one is in the first 7 verses, where he talks about creation's beginning, where he talks about where he started this whole thing and he created it. Now, all throughout Job chapter 3 to chapter 31, the world is really dark for Job, especially Job chapter 3. He's cursing the day that he was born. He wished he was never brought on this earth. When someone goes through extreme suffering, everything is terrible. It is the lens from which they see the world. Do you understand that? I have a mentor, Pastor Gordon, I call him. He just retired. He has an amazing relationship with his wife, but he would joke sometimes that his wife would come home and he wouldn't take Jonathan's advice and listen, and he would, but he just is tongue-in-cheek with this. His wife would come home, she'd have a bad day, and she'd be venting about her day and her life. And you know the comment is, when you sense something's wrong with someone, is everything okay? And he would say, is anything okay? Is anything okay? You know, like, because we all know we can get into that place. Men don't ever say that. We all know we can get into that place where everything's terrible. The food's terrible, relationships are terrible, my past is terrible, my future is terrible, and that's Job. One of the most painful things that Eric and I ever experienced before we had Caleb and Leah, we had a miscarriage. This was 20 years ago now. And I'll never forget it because it was July 1st. We had a miscarriage. It was extreme. It was traumatic. We went to the hospital. We came home. And I remember us sitting in our dark apartment, ironically, and kind of teary-eyed. And all of a sudden, it was getting dark at night. And we were just kind of in shock and awe of what was going on. And all I heard in the background was, and I'm like, what is explosions are going on? I was like, oh yeah, it's July 1st, Canada Day, fireworks. And we were in Moncton. And my first inclination of my heart, and you can judge me, was, what stupid people are celebrating today? Because it was the lens from which I viewed the world. Shut your face, stupid people. Right? And if you were Job, you're going to be not Job's friends and be a good friend at that time. You know what you do? You let that word pass. You don't have to correct it. I'm going to correct myself later. Right? You just let that pass. Job even says in Job chapter 7, words are like wind. That's just it. Let the wind pass. That you don't need to correct that, because that's the lens from which you're seeing the world. Everything's terrible. My past is terrible, Job is saying. My future is terrible, he's saying. Everything is dark. But God paints a different picture for Job. Look what he says. He says, when he was building this thing, and he was, as an architect, laying the foundation and stretching out its dimensions, in verse number 7, it says, while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy. Morning stars and angels are the exact same thing, by the way. Just a poetic way of saying the exact same thing. And so God is saying that the world is not completely dark, Job. As you see it, when you're in this pain, it feels like it. But there was a cosmic, joyful party when I created this thing that you know is reality, that you know is your existence. When I first started this thing, there was a cosmic, joyful party in heaven. This is the only place in the Bible we see this. Not in the creation story, not in any of the prophets, not in Revelation. This is the only place where God says that when I was creating, here's the picture. He's like taking this and he's taking, there's nothing and there's something. He's creating it. And the angels are standing back. Michael, oh my, look what our glorious God has done. Are you kidding me? He's outdone himself. Are you kidding me? Do you see this? Oh, look what our glorious God has done. He took something and he made nothing. And he's got planets and he's got animals. And do you see how it all works together? And man and woman. And God says in the creation story that he creates and it's good and it's good. And the angels are like, no kidding. No way. Are you kidding me? It was the party of all parties in heaven when God created this thing. And so God is saying, Job, you don't see this whole perspective. When I created this thing that you know is your existence and reality, substance, there was a cosmic party in heaven. There's some good parts to this thing still. Okay? But it's not all it's not all dark, but it's not all light either. And that's what God talks about next. It's not all light either. He talks about this darkness and light in the next by talking about the sea and the sunshine. You'll see that. The seas in verses 8 to 11, and then the sunshine, verses 12 to 14. Now, remember, it was week number 1, and in the book of Revelation, we talked about the sea. What does the sea represent for the biblical readers? Evil and chaos. Okay? It's only recently that we have this romantic understanding of the sea. Remember, in those days, it was this ominous, this scary thing that could end you in seconds. They only knew what was on the surface. Storms could come up at any time and destroy you. Like couldn't go into the depths of the sea. They could hold their breath and go down 20 feet, but it was this scary, ominous thing. The sea represents chaos and evil. Job even says this in his complaint to God. He says this, am I the sea? So Job's perception of the sea is it's something that God needs to contain. Am I the sea or the monster of the deep that you put me under guard? Job perceives the sea as something that God has to contain and limit, or it's going to become unruly and take over the whole world. Do you see that? And the monster from the deep, by the way, is Leviathan, the beast from the sea, from Revelation that only God can kill. And that is the ultimate comfort in the end, which we're going to get to next week. But I let the cat out of the bag. But here we are. So Job sees the sea as this dark, chaotic thing that God has to contain. All right? So look how God describes the sea. It burst forth from the room. He wrapped it in thick darkness. He fixed limits for it. He says, here your proud waves must halt. So God is the one who limits this thing. It's this poetic image of this unruly child that's under his care that he has to set limits for. It's a toddler under his care. In fact, wraps the sea in darkness. It's the same word as diapering. He diapers the sea. He wraps it and he sets limits for it. Like, you know, mom, when you're at the playground, you're like, don't go past there, don't go past there, don't go past there. And they have to, but it's an unruly child, but he has to keep it on a leash. He has to keep it on a leash. And so the sea is like that. This unruly child, this poetic image here, because this is all poetry, that he sets limits for, and it's under his care. But I want you to notice one thing. You ready to stare at the inscrutable? You ready to have your jaw drop here as you're ready to cue emails to me and send me all kinds of questions of what this means? Ready? Here we go. Look at what God is saying here. The sea is darkness. The sea itself is darkness and chaos. And what does he say? He wraps it in thick darkness. What? The sea itself is darkness and he wraps it in darkness? Could God be implying here that he uses darkness to limit darkness? Did you just stare at the inscrutable black hole and your brain explode? Does God use darkness to limit darkness? Like when you read Isaiah, I've been spending a lot of my devotion time in Isaiah during the pandemic because it's all about the sovereignty of God. And you see that God uses an evil king, Cyrus. You don't know me, acknowledge me, or want anything to do with me, but you're going to be used for my glory, and you're going to punish this more evil king over here. As D.A. Carson, one of my favorite theologians, says, put that in your theological pipe and smoke it. Does God use darkness to limit darkness? Look at Revelation. Remember the whore in Revelation that's in kind of cahoots with the beast? And then the beast turns on her and kills her? Like evil implodes upon itself? Whew. I see just the steam going out right now. Like we're staring at the inscription. Does God use darkness to limit darkness? Here we go. Let's keep pushing this in a little bit further. I give myself over to darkness every once in a while. You give yourself over to darkness every once in a while. Does God use your darkness to limit my darkness? And my darkness to limit your darkness sometimes? That's how big and sovereign God is. It's a toddler under his care. He contains and limits it, but he's using it for his glory. Let's go bigger. Here we go. There's an extreme darkness raising its putrid, disgusting, violently ugly head in Europe right now. And it must be stopped. It must be stopped. I told Erica, I'm like this close, ready to go over there to Ukraine, take up in arms. It has to be stopped. But make no mistake that the nations that are pushing back that putrid darkness are not pure, righteous light by any stretch of the imagination, especially the country that I'm from, Canada. I'm embarrassed at our darkness sometimes. Remember in the 2010 Olympics? Vancouver? They were in these commercials on TV to bolster Canadian pride in the Olympics, and they ended with, what the world needs is more Canada. What the world needs is more Canada. And it just was nails on the chalkboard for me. Well, the world does not need more Canada. It doesn't need more Australia, doesn't need more New Zealand, doesn't need more Thailand. It doesn't need more India, it doesn't need more Sudan, Nigeria, Spain, France, Germany, Russia, or Ukraine. It doesn't need any more of that. It needs more of Jesus and his reign in our hearts, right? So God's sovereignty is so big, even though there's pockets of light and pockets of darkness everywhere, that God even uses darkness for his glory. And then God talks about the sunrise, verse number 12 to 15. And he talks about, now we understand this, light pushes back darkness. And he talks about how that big ball gaseous thing in the sky that Job knows as the light source, it shakes the wicked out of it. It breaks the wicked's upraised arms. So there's this natural order to creation. How are we doing here? There's this natural order to creation that shakes the wicked out, that limits darkness of the darkness of human beings. Kind of like that I Am Legend zombie movie by Will Smith, like the zombies can only come out at night, but there's this, or in the daytime, the light destroys them. Like there's this natural order of the world of light that will push back darkness. So God is so big that God uses darkness to limit darkness, and he uses light to limit darkness. Wow. So he's saying here, the world is not completely light either. And there's a place for darkness that's contained under God's sovereignty, under my sovereignty. And Job's saying it's all dark. No, it's not completely dark. But it's not completely light either. And there's a place for darkness that's contained under my sovereignty. And then in verse number 19 to 20, look what he says. What is the way to the abode of light? Where does darkness reside? Can you take them to their place? Do you know the paths to their dwelling? He's basically saying there, Job, have you been at the epicenter of where light and darkness are? Like go to the epicenter where it was born and where it resides, and you stand there and you send out light to do your bidding, to keep order and limit chaos in the world, and you send out darkness to limit chaos and maintain order in the world. You do that. You stand at the epicenter and you maintain this order and fairness in the world. Have you ever done that, Job? Have you ever? Let's play Bruce Almighty for a minute. Okay? You've seen the movie? That's a really good movie, actually, because it kind of makes you see that if we were in God's shoes, like, what would we do? How would we do that? Okay, let's just play order and fairness in the world. Let's play the carnival game, whack-a-mole. You ever played the whack-a-mole game at the carnival where you got this club and the mole sticks his head up and you're like, bang, bang, and it gets faster and faster and faster. You know what I'm saying? Okay, so that's God, and we're going to play instant retribution for evil. That's what the Job's friends think is happening. So we're going to play instant retribution. The bad thing happens, you bang, 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 bang. That's God, okay? Let's just say that it happens instant and obvious. You step out of line, someone steps out of line, God, but not us, or not. We want grace and long suffering. We want grace in, grace out. We want long suffering for us, not my sin. Someone of the evil people sin over there, God plays whack-a-mole with. Okay, so he's playing whack-a-mole with someone else, not me. I want long suffering and grace. Okay, so we sin. Okay, we let darkness take over. Let's just say, let's pick a sin. Greed. You see a truck you want. Ladies, you see a house you want. You build up this thing in your heart and you're like, they probably get money given to them and how come they have that and I want that and I'm going to cheat and I'm going to lie and steal. I want that, okay? We've all been there. You see that truck drive by. Let's just say instant whack-a-mole game. God sees that in your heart. Automatically you hit a telephone pole. So does God cause $1,000 of damage, $5,000 of damage, or $20,000 of damage? Do you walk away without a scratch? Does he break your leg? Does he break your neck? Or does he kill you? And there are 7 billion people in the world, all giving themselves over to darkness at separate times. And the punishment has to fit the crime. We do this in our legal system. How do you maintain justice and order? By being a loving and gracious and long-suffering God in the world. It's a little more complex than that, isn't it? So the world isn't completely light either, but Job, you just have to trust me that there's a place for darkness that's contained under my sovereignty. So, the third movement, he talks about blessings and hardships. Now, one of Job's contentions, we don't have time, we could go back and see all this in Job's argument, because everything that God speaks to, he is speaking to something that Job has already said. But one of Job's contentions is that everything in God's world seems, is your mic on? Or is this me? Okay. Everything in God's world seems like it's just random. Okay? Let's focus here. Let's stay beyond this. Evil one wants to distract us with this. Let's focus here. Everything in God's world is just random. Life and death, blessing and cursing. In fact, one of the things that Job says in Job 21 is that wicked people thrive. The friends are saying that righteous people thrive and that good people and that evil people are destroyed. And Job looks in Job 21 and he says, that's not what I see in the world. I see that wicked people that don't even want anything to do with you, God, seem to be thriving. That doesn't make sense to me. It seems like for Job, God is this kind of nutty professor. He's really smart and he can figure out quantum physics, but he's just a little bit disorganized in an unmade bed. And Job kind of got lost in the paperwork somewhere. And I was like, oh, sorry, Job. I was trying to figure out everything, how to run the universe. But God paints a different picture for Job by talking about his intimate relationship with water. This one substance, God can just change the temperature, and with one substance, in one form, it can be destruction and judgment, in verse 22 to 23. And he changes the temperature again, and it brings amazing blessing and grace into our lives. And we all know that if it stops raining on this planet, we all die. There's no two ways about it. If it stops, what are they looking for on Mars? They're looking for water, because if they find water, they think they find life. Water is life. Our bodies are made up of like 70% water. Rain is blessing. If it stops raining, we die. And God says, I want to show you my intimate relationship with this one substance called water. And then he talks about the frost and the dew and the hail and the rain. But I can just alter it just ever so slightly, and I can bring blessing with it, or I can bring destruction with it. And so Job's contention is that God, you're just random, you just kind of like run the universe, but you're not intimately involved in my life. And God says, I am intimately involved in the world and bringing blessing and destruction by just taking one element, this thing called water, changing the temperature of it. And I can bring blessing and you flourish, or I can bring destruction. I'm intimately involved in that. And then even in the context of that, he talks about the planets. And the ancient biblical people understood that the laws of the universe and the planets were carefully tuned to align life, like life is balanced on a razor's edge. Okay, and we even know this today. But even more so than Job, did you know that Jupiter in our solar system is a cosmic vacuum? Like if the gravitational pull on Jupiter is 2.5 times what it is on Earth. So if I weigh 200 pounds, I weigh 500 on Jupiter. I'm glad you live on Earth. That if it wasn't for Jupiter sucking in all kinds of cosmic space dust, and I'm not talking about the size of your fist, I'm talking about stuff the size of Edmonton, like sucking in cosmic space, that the amount of projectiles hitting the Earth would be 100 times more. Like you watch the Weather Channel, you'd be watching the Meteor Channel. Take your iron umbrella out today. It's coming. But if it wasn't for Jupiter, that's just one thing on how God's finely tuned the universe to sustain our existence. I am intimately aware of bringing blessing and bringing destruction into your life. And listen to how God talks about this thing called rain. In verse 34, can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water, the blessing? Can you command it? Can you send the lightning bolts on their way? Can you keep destruction away by your command? Do they report to you, here we are? Who gives the ibis his wisdom? Who gives the rooster its understanding? Charles Spurgeon, when he was preaching on this, he said this, man can't make it rain, neither can man make God pour out his grace. If both the houses of Parliament were to be called together and the Queen were to sit upon her throne of state, and they were to unanimously pass an act ordering the rain to fall, he that sits in the heavens would laugh. The Lord would hold them in derision, for the key of rain is in no hand except that of Jehovah. God is intimately involved in bringing blessing and hardship into our lives. He's not just some random nutty professor that's smart but doesn't understand. He's intimately involved, and we cannot with our voices command God's blessing, nor can we prevent suffering just by saying stop rain, stop thunderstorm, start rain, stop thunderstorm. But here's what we can do. Look what he talks about there. Who gives the ibis wisdom or gives the rooster understanding? The ibis is a migratory bird, like our geese. The rooster is a domesticated bird. And we all know that animals, particularly, can be affected by weather patterns. They have an internal barometer, but especially birds. Birds have an amazing internal barometer. They can sense when weather patterns are going to change. The ibis, so for instance, for those that aren't hunters, here's how it works for geese. The geese go up north in the summer, and then once it gets colder, they basically stay in front of the snow and ice pack, and they hit here around end of September and October. And once everything freezes up around here, they keep moving south. They stay in front of it, and then in the spring, they basically chase the snow and ice as it melts back north. Okay? So the ibis can't command or change the weather. They just adapt themselves to it. And the rooster, so I don't have a rooster, but I'm told that roosters, they usually caw in the morning and you just want to shoot that thing. But They also, if there's a weather pattern coming in the next day, they become restless and they'll start cawing at night. And so if a rooster caws at night, you'll know it's maybe going to rain tomorrow. So they can kind of sense it, but they can't command it. They just accept and adapt according to it. And so he's giving two examples in creation of here, what it means to live with wisdom and understanding with this whole understanding of blessings and hardships in our life. Do you see that? That to live with wisdom and understanding is to know that God is intimately involved in bringing those blessings and hardships into our lives. And there's this kind of acceptance and adjustment that we need to make to that. Just like the ibis and the rooster. So Job, God is not some nutty professor. He's not some smart but disorganized God that's forgot about you. He's intimately involved in bringing these things into your life. But you can't control them. And this is also kind of a knock against the friends, because the friends thought that they could somehow force God's hand to bless them, or with their lifestyle, and with their lifestyle prevent all suffering. And that's not always the case, as we see in Job's story. Okay? The fourth movement here has to do with the harsh aspects of creation. Now, what Job experienced was very harsh. It was very fierce, and he told God that. We don't have time to get into all these examples, but he's basically, God, you're shooting me with these poisonous arrows, and everything that I'm experiencing in my life right now is extremely harsh. And God goes on to talk about some of the wild and the dangerous and the harshest and the fiercest animals in creation. And the only time that he talks about the cute, cuddly ones is when he's talking about what the lions and the ravens eat, when he's talking about the prey. So you notice it when he starts off talking about the lion is crouching in their dens. Where do they get their food? Well, let me tell you, there's a mountain goat and there's a deer, and they're crouching too. So we're meant to see that connection with the crouch and the crouch. They're crouching to give birth, and this is what they eat. So this is like you're watching the Animal Channel, and like the leopard's chasing the gazelle, and the crocodile's chasing the zebra, and then it's like mouth opens, and then it's cut scene. We don't want to watch it, but God doesn't cut the scene. Like he's saying there's some harsh elements to creation. Right? Yes, there is going to be a time in the future where the lion lies down with the lamb, and that's going to be a whole new heavens and a whole new earth. But right now, there are some harsh aspects to this creation. He talks about the lion and the raven, which feeds on the carcasses that the lion eats, the wild donkey, the wild ox, which, by the way, is not the ox that we would know. It's an auroch, which went extinct around in the 1600s. Julius Caesar wrote about these things. Their shoulder was about 6 feet tall, mean, fierce testosterone beast. No cowboy would jump on the back of this thing and say, this will be fun. It was pure mean, okay? And so he's talking about all these fierce and wild things about creation. And Job has certainly experienced some harsh things. And in the midst of all of these harsh things in creation, there's this oddly weird, harsh thing as well, the ostrich. I love how he talks about the ostrich. And Job's experience is very much an ostrich. It's odd and it's harsh. It doesn't fit our understanding of what goes on is normal in the animal kingdom. I mean, what is this thing? And God even laughs at it. It's got wings, but it can't fly, but it can run faster than a horse. Did you know that the eyeballs of this thing close this way instead of this way? There's 3 sets of eyeballs. This stupid thing will bury its head in the sand when you're chasing it because it's scared. You can't see me. And he made it stupid. And it says it even treats its young harshly. And so this experience, and there's all the harsh animals that God talks about here, there's an oddly harsh one too that doesn't fit with their understanding of what an animal is supposed to be in the animal kingdom. So next time you experience a really out of nowhere suffering, just look at your spouse and say, this is an ostrich. This is an absolute ostrich. This doesn't make sense. What is it? It's an ugly, horrendous, odd-looking thing. Is it a bird? Is it a run faster? It is odd. And so you can kind of see Job smile, like Job, God understands me. There's this odd, harsh thing that came my way. And so what he's saying here is that I, God, have ultimate control over all the oddly wild and harsh things that happen to us. He does. Like, he's the one who gives all of the strength and all of the idiosyncrasies and all the proclivities to these harsh things. He has ultimate control over all of that. And I know that's hard for us to accept. It's hard for us to watch those nature shows of predator and prey. It really doesn't make us feel safe, but here it makes Job feel safe. And I think if we see this through the New Testament lens, it makes us even feel safer and more comfortable. Just watch this. God is admitting that there are some harsh aspects to this created world. And Job experienced the ostrich, the odd thing that didn't make sense. But in the New Testament, we see that God himself submitted himself through the form of Jesus, his only begotten Son, to some of the harshest aspects of creation. And he didn't cause it. He was innocent like Job, even more innocent than Job. He went to the cross. Do you see this? I want you to notice something here. When I was studying this was so ironic. Look at the fierce animals that God talks about here. Look at what he starts with and look what he ends with. I'm not going to write a book on this, but I think this is so ironic. He starts with a lion and he ends with an eagle. He starts with a lion and he's talking about the harshest aspects of his creation. And we look to 1 Peter, and what does Peter say that Satan is? A roaring lion looking around for someone to devour. And then he ends with an eagle. And look how grotesque he talks about this eagle. Its young ones feast on blood where the slain there it is. Did you know that the eagle is the symbol for the Roman Empire that killed Jesus? And particularly the Roman legion? That God himself submitted himself to the fiercest animal, lion, on this, that through Satan, through Rome, and yes, it was my sin that nailed him there, absolutely, but it was Satan involved with the Roman Empire, that he submitted himself to the fiercest, harshest aspects of creation. Do we need to play the Passion of the Christ? So that they feasted on his blood, so that we in a life-giving way can feast upon his blood? You see, through the New Testament lens, in Christ's work on the cross, we find our eternal safety. Am I ultimately safe with God? Yes, because of the cross of Christ. And God himself submitted himself to the harshest aspects so that we can be eternally safe with him. So just to recap here, here's God's movements with his speech. The world is not completely dark, Job, like you said it was, and there is a cosmic joyful party when God created this thing. But it's not completely light either. And there's a place for darkness and chaos that is contained under my sovereignty. And Job, despite what you think about my randomness in the world, I'm intimately involved in bringing blessing and hardship into your life, and you can't command it away or prevent all hardship. And God has ultimate control over those oddly wild and harsh things that happen to us. And we know that we are ultimately safe in Christ. And so God is saying, just trust my sovereignty, Job. You're ultimately safe with me, even though in your current circumstance, it does not feel like it. All right, let's land the plane here. Come on up, Dale. I want us to see one final thing here as we get ready to worship in one last song. I said, note where God speaks to Job from. Where did he speak to Job from? The storm. He speaks to Job from the storm. And this is poetry, and we're meant to see this. And in fact, I purposely made the main slide of our series here a storm. Because throughout history, even in Job's time, a storm has been a metaphor for hardship, difficulties, Likewise, sunshiny days is a metaphor for good times. We sing about that even in pop culture. You don't have to give examples. Like a storm is hardship. Sunshiny days is good times. In fact, Job defines his experience in chapter 30. You can see it there, where he says to God, you throw me into the world when you destroy me in the storm. You brought this storm into my life, God. And where does God speak to Job? Is it from the sunshiny day? No, it's from the storm. And we're meant to see this. We're meant to see that the place of our deepest pain has the potential to be the place of our deepest intimacy with God. See, the storm is where God meets him, and it's where God wants to meet you if you will let him. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, said, God whispers in our pleasures, he speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pain. It is a megaphone to rouse a deaf world. The place of your deepest pain has the potential to be the place of your deepest intimacy with God. It's in Job's story, but it's also in the gospel story. It's in the story of the cross. It's the place where God's deepest pain of him sacrificing his only begotten son when all of the sin of the world was on his shoulders and he was innocent. And the Father turns his face away. That place of the Father's deepest pain has the potential to be the place of his deepest intimacy with you. It's the cross. And that, my friends, should be the one thing now as New Testament believers that should cause us to put our hand over our mouth aghast and say, I am unworthy, just like Job. Worship team, won't you come? We're going to close by singing the Revelation song. I can't think of any other better song to sing after this. After we've just stared at the glory of God. In Revelation chapter 4 and 5, he's looking at the center of the universe. He's looking at God himself. And he asks the question, who is worthy? And then he says, he is worthy, he is worthy. So let's worship with this song in response to all that God is and all that God has done for us.